2009 was a year of many MMORPG launches, but none grander than Aion, the Tower of Eternity. NCSoft's mega title boasting the incredibly gorgeous CryEngine used by famous benchmark game Crysis, verticality in the way of flying mechanics and movement, and a crowning feature and focus on a region titled the Abyss, a blend of PvP/VE in-game mechanics that look to emulate previous MMO standouts and Dark Age of Camelot. NCSoft, a Korean publisher famous for titles such as Lineage 1 and 2, and their more recent successes in Guild Wars 2 and Blade and Soul. This was one of the first times NCSoft had the idea of bringing one of their Asian-specific IPs to the Western market, accompanied by a brand new US office. But despite Aion's initial success, Aion never quite took off with the NA or EU audiences, not like it did in Korea. And that's where this episode comes into play. Why didn't Aion quite take off in the Western market despite its obvious push towards such? And what is the future of an MMORPG that has been running now for nearly 10 years? On this episode of Death of a Game, we will tackle the first of the Asian MMORPG Western adaptations in NCSoft's Aion, and its failure to capture a large Western audience. Pay attention to the clues along the way so maybe we can solve this mystery together. And near the end of this video, I will pop open my journal and make sure you guys get caught up. And make sure to stay tuned till the end, where we drop a special hint on what the next Death of a Game video will be about. Oh, and I'm actually right this time, guys. It's pronounced Aion.
Aion has led you here. Aion has led you here.
The story of Aion starts as far back as May 2006, where Korean publisher NCSoft, of Lineage notoriety, announced that they would be creating a new MMORPG titled Aion, the Tower of Eternity. The head of product development said the following of the project: NCSoft believes online gaming to be the next cinema in entertainment, and Aion was created to tackle the next challenge for the MMORPG enhanced interaction, said Joo-hyung Jung. Sorry, Korean fans. This, as the article also explained, was the first internally developed MMORPG title since Lineage 2 for NCSoft. Following this announcement by a mere 2 years, NCSoft announced a formation of a Western office to complement their headquarters located in Seoul, South Korea. NCSoft's CEO Taek-jin said that NC West will become a more powerful force to be reckoned with in the Western MMO market. NCSoft wasn't just satisfied with conquering Korea, with the most popular MMORPG title there being Lineage, a NCSoft title, an MMO that even in 2018, 20 years after its launch, can continue to make dozens of millions every year. Now, the story of Lineage's success is a story for another video, but needless to say, its level of success in Korea is the equivalent of WoW's success in the Western world. Lineage had generated by 2017 over $2.6 billion in revenue. But this success couldn't really translate to the Western markets. In order to become a global corporation with global influence, they needed a Western presence. Guild Wars 1 had launched in 2005, and ArenaNet, being a subsidiary of NCSoft, certainly helped spread that influence. And NCSoft would then plan to launch a number of MMORPGs over the following couple of years. Despite this announcement though, NCSoft still planned on releasing Aion to the Korean public first and follow it with a Western launch a year later. It's hard to learn any details or clues about the development cycle of an MMO. We just know that Brian Knox, a producer on Aion, later stated that he believed the development for the game was around 5 years. We also know that NCSoft launched their first playable open beta for Korea in November of 2008. The open beta was quite successful. Over 100,000 players were playing concurrently at the same time, and nearly 11,000 players had started playing 2 minutes after the beta launched. NCSoft was happy with the success of the open beta and proceeded with their Korean launch date of November 25th, 2008, as a subscription-based MMORPG. Yes, a subscription-based MMORPG. Despite the idea that Korean MMOs are all of the FTP or free-to-play variant, NCSoft's particular style was typically that of a subscription model, such as their mega hit in Lineage 1, or a buy-to-play title, such as Guild Wars 1 or Guild Wars 2. And thus they were intent on launching their new Aion project to their Korean audience as a subscription-based MMORPG. It was quite bold of NCSoft to launch an MMORPG in Aion to the Korean audience as a subscription-based MMORPG, especially when other games had already started to transition towards more free-to-play types. Nonetheless, NCSoft launched Aion in Korea and other Asian countries on November 25th, 2008, and its success was immediately felt. By May of 2009, months after launch, Aion had achieved 3.5 million subscribers in Asia. In just one fiscal quarter, the game generated $32.7 million for NCSoft. At this point for the Western audience, Aion still seemed to be like a further off prospect. Not much knew what to expect from a Korean MMORPG, but many were certainly going to the lengths to acquire Korean-made Aion accounts, which required a Korean social security in order to play Aion. NCSoft promised a fall launch in 2009 for the Western audience, and opened up pre-orders the summer of 2009 for the Western audience. Aion achieved over 400,000 pre-orders in the US alone. Clearly the overseas hype had reached the Western audience in a great fashion, and it's easy to see why. Aion used the CryEngine, an engine primarily created for the Far Cry franchise, but also most famously was the engine of the blockbuster PC title, Crysis, aka the official benchmark of your PC. This meant that Aion, unlike other MMOs at the time, could look absolutely gorgeous and breathtaking, something you can't say about most MMOs, at least when compared to titles such as RPGs or shooters. This of course meant that the main concern for Aion's success was how they were able to handle the performance of their title, because graphical fidelity is great, but MMOs at large haven't focused on such because of its large effects on performance. But Korea didn't seem to have terrible performance issues, and producer Brian Knox promised that the CryEngine scaled perfectly. That would remain to be seen in the Western world, as Korea not only had better internet infrastructure than the West, it has more access to top-of-the-line PCs in the form of PC bangs. The hype for Aion, though, was full steam ahead, and some even asked the question of, can Aion dethrone the king of the Western market MMORPGs, World of Warcraft? That was a lofty goal, of course, but 2009 was peak WoW killer period, a series of major MMORPGs that all looked to grab some of WoW's success and even compete head-to-head, and most, if not all, failing to do such. Aion would launch in the Western world on September 22nd, 2009. Aion was widely successful in America, managing to remain at #1 on Steam, as well as becoming 52% of NCSoft's overall sales. NCSoft at the time's quarterly revenues rose 112%, for a total of $142 million. They even managed to sell nearly 1 million total copies in the NA and EU combined. Aion's critical success, however, wasn't as overwhelmingly successful. Instead, they managed to pull a 76 on Metacritic. Review sites such as Eurogamer, PC Gamer, and GameSpot thought the game was overly grind-focused and suffered from a linear feel of sorts. Whereas IGN gave them an 85, stating that the game was beautiful, well-polished, and they enjoyed the new winged combat that made up the fights in the Abyss, a PvPvE zone where you could travel to after level 25 that allowed for both PvP and PvE leveling. In order to travel to the Abyss, you needed to find a rift that appears in particular areas on the map, after completing a questline. This was both one of the more successful aspects of Aion, and problematic ones. The Abyss was a great idea, basically the same idea as Darkness Falls from Dark Age of Camelot, where you have a dungeon that can be invaded by multiple factions, but also can house higher level group content and PvE to progress your character. This means no matter how you sliced it in Aion, at least at launch, you would need to risk being killed to progress past a certain level. This was a very popular feature with the Aion community, but certainly put off those who weren't expecting to have to PvP in Aion. But to be honest, I think the bigger problem in Aion is that it's not that it's the Abyss or Rift systems where players can basically visit other factions and PvPvE for more experience, it's more so the engine, CryEngine. It couldn't really function at the scale that NCSoft was wanting them to perform with Aion. Who would have thought a unproven flashy engine could have issues? Many early large-scale fights were plagued with the same performance issues previous PvPvE titles, such as Warhammer and Dark Age of Camelot, suffered from at times. It's just that in Aion's case, they were never really going to overcome such a hurdle due to how difficult it was to run the game performance-wise, which also limits the audience to a small extent. Aion's combat, however, despite seeming more simplistic when compared to other Asian titles, is deceptively complicated. For example, based on where you attack your opponent and what movement you were using at the time, it changes how your character is buffed or what buffs your character obtains. When you backpedal, it increases your block rate, while running forward increases your damage, and lateral movement increases your dodge ability. And besides the combat being a typical tab target combat system, it does have some minor combo abilities. But where Aion's gameplay really shines is its flight system. This is a big part of Aion's selling point and gameplay design. It's based around flying. Unfortunately, you can't fly on the majority of the non-Abyss locations in Aion. You can, however, glide there, but gliding is on a timer that can be extended, but not fully removed. Like the previous Abyss feature, this is another example where Aion has its crowning feature that's also just, well, flawed. There hasn't ever been a really good reason why the flying and gliding systems weren't fully fleshed out. Why do they limit flying so much in a game that is supposed to revolve around such? It makes players have to worry far more about their flying timers than the actual gameplay at hand. But the other problems that arise when you take things into the air are problems in firing off abilities, especially for the melee crowd. Flying inherently helps ranged classes, and Aion didn't really do a good job of initially balancing such. So being a melee class who could fly meant that you still had to fly after a ranged class that could snipe you from afar. Not to mention getting flooded with those messages that you can't hit your target or you can't see your target over and over again because of some weird bug that starts to happen whenever you start flying combat. That was also very annoying. Flying and gliding in Aion feels half-baked. I would have loved to see them really build the game more around the aspects of verticality and flying. Even in typical maps within Aion, or a quest or just content, none of this really supports flying, like it should at least. What if there were more quest cities or regions that could only be reached by vertical flight, for example? Now, despite being flawed, Aion was still an amazing looking title, and certainly had enough grind to keep its players busy for at least a year after launch, managing to actually increase in overall subscriptions following a year of the service being live. Aion's success in the Western market was impressive for the fledgling MMORPG, but shortly following their strong launch and a few months after, Aion dropped in players by over 1 million overall subscriptions. Now, I unfortunately don't know how many of these players are NA versus EU versus Korea, but we certainly know that the game was still being successful in Korea in 2010. Not even Aion's first supposed expansion, Aion Assault on Balearia, which was admittedly more like a content patch of sorts, could resurrect the game's loss of players or obtain more players, period. One theme you'll notice early on in this video is as Aion continues early on to thrive in Korea, it suffers in the Western world. This especially for NCSoft, which had already had experience with such a transition with their City of Heroes title, was more than prepared and willing to transition Aion in the West to being a free-to-play MMORPG. And certainly, that had some people worried. But with Aion Ascension, or Aion 3.0 as it was dubbed, 3.0 would add more zones, player housing, mounts, and more instances. But most importantly, it would feature a full revamp of the business model, which meant an inevitable push towards pay to convenience, and maybe even pay to win. NCSoft will go on to do just fine with their free-to-play adaptations in the West in terms of its fairness, at least in the NA regions. But at the last second, they pivoted their EU publishing role to another prominent EU free-to-play company, Gameforge, and well, it's easy to see why Gameforge hasn't exactly been the best publisher for Aion, and certainly hurts it in the West. The majority of negative reviews on Steam, for example, where Aion Free-to-Play also launched, mentioned Gameforge as being a particularly terrible publisher, one who attempts to milk their audience as much as possible. Prime example of this is how in order to access basic aspects of an MMORPG such as trading or looking for group, you needed to purchase a gold pack, which actually expires after 30 days. And while it can technically be purchased in-game by in-game money, it's not exactly easy for a new player without access to trading in the first place to make money. NCSoft doesn't have the equivalent system in NA, hence why when talking about Aion we talk about 3 different versions. Aion NA, which was free to play, Aion Gameforge, which became free to play as well, and Aion in Korea, which at this point was still subscription based. Aion NA and Gameforge share the same content update schedules, but different publishers with different business strategies. So globally, as of 2012, Aion has an obvious dip in popularity and monetary success. Aion drops over 25% of sales overall for NCSoft. Aion Korea is a major focus for NCSoft and continues to operate as the top MMORPG in Korea in 2012. Well, that's up until a competitor under the same umbrella launches and captures a large Asian audience. Blade & Soul, developed by NCSoft and also positioned to do exactly what Aion did, and that's launch first in Korea and follow such a launch with an eventual NA and EU launch. When Blade & Soul launched in Korea, it was a massive boost to their revenue, and as the financials from NCSoft on screen show, both Guild Wars 2, which also had a serious launch in 2012, and Blade & Soul were the primary revenue drivers for NCSoft. Aion took an obvious hit immediately, as it shrunk to only 16% of NCSoft's sales. The reason Blade & Soul was, and still continues to be, a large reason for Aion's slowing in success is due to the fact that Blade & Soul is also very visually appealing as a title, but unlike Aion, it's not nearly as reliant on large content as it focuses primarily on small-scale PvP. Therefore, it doesn't really have the same performance issues. Not to mention, Blade & Soul has incredible combat, probably the best we've seen in a tap target MMO. Combat that certainly makes Aion look 3 years old at the time. But Blade & Soul didn't just outdo Aion in the Western market, and has mostly continued to do such, it also had outperformed Aion in Korea, usurping Aion's role as the most played MMORPG in 2012 and from then on. It seemed like Aion would make slight jumps in recovery regarding its population and sales at times, but largely from 2013 to 2015, Aion would continue to perform quite average. And by the end of 2015, Guild Wars 2 and Blade & Soul would all outperform Aion according to the 2015 NCSoft financials. Classic Lineage 1, a game by that point was 17 years old, was outperforming all of those games combined, which, as previously mentioned, that's a video for another time. Aion as of 2015 continues to exist in mostly obscurity in the West. Even though the free-to-play switch had certainly saved how much revenue Aion would be contributing in the West, it didn't do exactly enough to keep its player base from slowly dying off. For some reason, despite an obvious focus for NCSoft, they couldn't quite get their game to stick in the West. And although their new MMORPG was outperforming Aion in both markets, Aion was still doing more than well enough in Korea with its subscription model. Not even Aion 4.0 or Dark Betrayal, as the expansion was known that launched in June of 2013 by, jumped up sales by 12% before quickly dropping back down by 2015. This is sort of where you learn the crux of the video, really. And that's simply that NCSoft is first and foremost a Korean company who relies on subsidiaries to run their most successful NA/EU title in Guild Wars 2. They are pretty much focused on their MMORPGs doing well first and foremost in Korea, and that explains why they not only launch MMOs first there, they give them the first taste of content as well. Instead of being angry that they focus on their home audience more, let's analyze why. As all of the financials I have showed thus far was that if you take into account the Korean market on the left side graph, it actually shows how much sales each market makes up, and Korea accounts for more than 64% of NCSoft's overall sales, while NA and EU make a combined 25%. So nearly 3/4 of their business is reliant on their Korean success. This is frankly why I'm convinced that NCSoft and companies similar to them aren't really reliant or so focused on their Western markets. If anything, they see them as an added bonus. Naturally, they want their launches to do well in the Western market, but if it was such a large focus, I think not only would they change the way they market and monetize the Western market, it would probably also mean that they would launch an MMORPG globally, and not just Eastern and then Western regions. But NCSoft doesn't live or die by the success in their Western market, and in 2015, 6 years after launch, Aion was still doing well enough locally in Korea to carry its successes over both the NA and EU markets. In 2015, NCSoft was having a smash success in the MMORPG space in Korea. They had 4 MMOs in the top 10 most popular in Korea, and 3 in the top 4. Aion had a number of more content launches. A 5.0 launch in July of 2016, which, for the first time that I have seen in an MMO, actually took content away instead of adding it in certain regards. For example, they took land away from the Abyss and simplified the flight paths. They also bumped up the player level to 45 and made the upper layer of the zone only for levels 68 to 75. Both population and sales for Aion dropped during this period, and continue to drop, well into 2017, as content patches and expansions seem to all but dry up. The overall sales match this, and we can likely infer a drop in player count, not to mention based on PC Bang rankings for most of these titles, Aion moved from its #1 MMO spot to being ranked the 5th most played MMO in Korea, while Blade & Soul manages to make the top 10 most played game list period, not just MMOs. I think it's fair to speculate that this could be due to the fact that an MMO in Aion was already live for 10 years in Korea, and was still requiring a sub-feed to its audience. And with Blade & Soul's success in Korea with a free-to-play model, it was a no-brainer that by the beginning of 2018, NCSoft announced plans to change Aion's business model in Korea to a free-to-play one, accompanying their 6.0 release dubbed A New Dawn. A New Dawn was promised to be a rebirth of sorts for Aion. It promised a plethora of new content, included new PvP zones for factional warfare and the like, and this success was immediately felt following the launch, as NCSoft is able to start their Q1 of 2018 with quite the strong start for Aion, nearly doubling in sales after the free-to-play switch. At this point, it's very unlikely anything grand will change the landscape of current Aion in either market though. It will likely continue to slowly dwindle in population and overall sales until NCSoft shutters the title when it's no longer financially successful, at least in Korea. As NCSoft has proven with City of Heroes in the past, as long as the title is doing well in Korea, it has a very low chance of being shut down. RIP City of Heroes. But juicy rumors hit the web of a possible Aion sequel. According to the article on screen, the reason a Aion 2 was possible was due to NCSoft dubbing a new MMORPG yet announced, A2. Apparently NCSoft had often dubbed MMORPGs with code names, but had never assigned a number to one. This speculation was fed in summer of 2018 when NCSoft was posting jobs for an unannounced title based on the Aion IP. Now sure, it's easy to assume that it was a mobile launch, Lineage had a mobile launch and so did Blade & Soul, or is soon to have a mobile launch, and based on NCSoft's financials, well, it's easy to see why they are making mobile games, which is the equivalent of nearly $500 million in revenue, by the way. There is still hope that the Aion franchise can be continued, much like the first Lineage title was. Though it's likely safe to say that Aion as it stands now won't ever reach the same heights they reached upon launch, especially considering they still haven't updated their engine from CryEngine 2, whereas CryEngine 5.5 is already live. Currently, as of November 2017, according to the Steam charts, tracking by NA and EU populations, Aion has only 1,200 or so concurrent players, which is a 1,800 player drop from the 3K peak they were able to reach during the launch of Aion 6.0. And as we are near the end of this story, I find the question of why Aion wasn't able to maintain its success isn't quite answered yet. Why was Aion still having its moderate success in Korea in 2018, meanwhile existed as a fringe title in the Western market? I think the simplest answer, and by simplest I mean that it's simple to explain and not necessarily to quantify, but it's quite obvious that the Korean MMO audience is frankly different than the Western MMO audience. And Aion, personally for me, someone who played the game at launch, was a bit too grindy and samey at times. Such Asian MMO games rely really on slow, linear gear and level progressions, a tactic that's very effective in Korea, but doesn't have the same level of success in the EU or NA, and frankly you can chalk that up to cultural. I postulate that Koreans are far more willing to dedicate more time and put up with grind-based gameplay compared to a Western audience. And since MMOs and frankly PC gaming in Korea is so normalized, they are far more accepting of free-to-play business practices. For example, for the longest time Aion in Korea sold a bundle based on RNG that could potentially reward you with one of the best weapons in the game. I haven't seen a whole lot of complaining about that. Why is the Korean audience as a whole more fine with this than, say, a Western audience? I don't completely know yet, and that's a question I will look to answer at some point, maybe in another video, maybe doing a video describing the differences between the Korean, Japanese, and Western gaming audiences. Now that's an idea. But to wrap up this video, it's safe to say that the Western audience wasn't nearly as forgiving as the Korean audience in regards to MMOs. But it's depressing that NCSoft let Gameforge, their EU publisher, essentially attempt to milk its audience as much as possible. I think this hurts the Western opinion of free-to-play titles, or simply, Korean titles, because we've seen this time and time again in the MMORPG genre. Asian MMOs that launched years after their initial launch in the Western audience and then proceed to apply many of the same business practices that work in Korea to a Western audience. This obviously has very negative results in regards to retention, but is it too far to suggest that perhaps retention really isn't the major focus in the Western audience? Perhaps the damage is already done when people continue to buy and support MMOs that essentially try and keep your wallet permanently open. We've seen it with ArcheAge and most recently Black Desert Online. One thing's for sure though, the Korean and Western markets are certainly different and respond to different features and design choices, well, differently. And NCSoft attempting to take a standard Eastern MMO in Aion, one that's absolutely gorgeous but relies on a grind mechanic for its main content source, and assuming it will just work the same way in both markets is, well, it's just not really gonna work that way. But to end this video on a high note, maybe Aion can not only recapture some of its original hype with a sequel title, but perhaps even overshadow it. Especially during this current drought in MMOs. Though deep down I fear, this same drought is the one that keeps the MMO player base dealing with these bad business practices disguised in free-to-play games because, well, what else is there to play? We can strive for better and vote with our dollars, and maybe after failing to capture a Western audience with Aion, perhaps NCSoft has the appropriate knowledge to attempt a sequel, and actually deliver on their goal and vision for the MMORPG. But perhaps NCSoft will continue to reap their successes in Korea, and have no further interest in capturing a Western audience, besides with what Guild Wars 2 already does. But I think we both know that big corporations want all the success that they can get. Now it's that time of the video where I check with you guys to see if you have been keeping up with solving this mystery. Let's open up our journals and remember our diagnosis for the largest reasons for Aion's failure. Aion was the first attempt at a global launch for NCSoft, and as such it suffered from a lack of knowledge and understanding of the Western market. Aion utilized the CryEngine, which is although why we will likely remember the game, it's also why the performance issues have continued to plague the game since launch. Server client lag and large PvP battles which made up the majority of in-game content. NCSoft is focused first and foremost on its Korean audience, which makes playing it as an EU or an NA fan not so enjoyable. Gameforge, the EU publisher, sucked its customers dry. Well, that sounds grosser than intended. Blade & Soul outshined Aion and continues to do so in 2018. ArcAge and Black Desert Online in the Western market greatly outshined Aion when launched a few years back. The proverbial dagger. It's not the easiest mystery to solve, I realize, and it's certainly not as apparent as other ones have been. But mysteries aren't always so cut and dry. Sometimes it's not just one content patch or a sudden exodus. Sometimes it's factors such as age, competition, and engine limitations that catch up with an aging MMO. Especially in the case of an Asian MMO such as Aion, which is heavily reliant on their graphical presentation as one of their crowning features. Not to mention their combat system and aerial combat aspects. It's hard to maintain as a game that bases much of its identity and success on timing in the marketplace. When games like ArcAge and Black Desert Online launched in the West and boast far better graphics, engines, and combat systems than Aion, it's easy to see why Aion became such a forgotten game. This is likely my biggest observation when judging Asian MMORPGs, especially the ones that rely primarily on their graphics or presentation. It's essentially an arms race. Think of creating the fastest car in the world. Within a few years, it's very likely someone will have created a faster car. And in the case of Aion, multiple publishers and competitors simply made better looking and better functioning MMOs. I think this easily illustrates that designing an MMO around its ability to look right certainly has its negatives as well. Perhaps if Aion focused more on separating itself from the pack, say for example having a larger focus on its flying mechanics being a unique feature of their game. But if your game isn't really all that unique, and doesn't fulfill a need in the marketplace in particular, it's easy to fade away when another better looking game and better playing game shows up and just outdoes you. Thanks for watching, guys. Or is it the end of this video? As I was typing out that goodbye, a Discord member of mine notified me of some more current news considering NCSoft, and most importantly for this video, Aion. It turns out that the rumored Aion 2 came true and was just announced at NC Media Day at NCSoft's Media Day. That's a first for breaking news on this show. Yes, Aion 2 is official and is currently in development. According to the article on screen, Aion 2 takes place 900 years before the PC game, Aion the Tower of Eternity. One main feature is the appearance of dimensional cracks allowing players from different servers to engage, and large PvP. Gliding and wings will no doubt be there as the IP signature element. NCSoft even claimed that Aion 2 will have features which could not be realized in the PC game. Wait a minute. And that its vision for the game is no longer a dream. Huh, that's a lot of hype words used. But these dimensional cracks sound like a more developed rift system of sorts. And it certainly makes me feel vindicated when NCSoft is kind of in agreement with me and other players who agree that flying and gliding shouldn't be so restricted, as the article yet again explains. Finally, another huge change is the removal of gliding constraints found in Aion. While this was not explained in detail, NCSoft is making gliding a part of the combat loop to create a three-dimensional battle system. That sounds interesting. And Aion 2 being developed in Unreal Engine 4, that's going to make flying and gliding an integral part of the game. That sounds like a fun experience that we originally expected from the first Aion. All certainly sounds promising, and I hope the "it's a mobile game" memes don't curse Aion 2's fate like it just did with Diablo's, I mean. Don't you guys have phones? Well, Aion does have a mobile game announced, Aion Tempest, which people speculate could have became Aion 2. It's possible at least, but I don't think that it's that likely, as Blade & Soul and Lineage both have mobile games that merely complement their actual MMORPGs. No one would launch an MMORPG based on a prior PC franchise exclusively on a mobile platform. Sure, Blizzard made the same move with Diablo Immortal, but NCSoft wouldn't make a numbered sequel a mobile game, right? Especially not one that was originally on PC. And it turns out, shortly after I read that announcement, I read another announcement. Take back everything I said about promising. This really is the darkest timeline, where all future MMORPGs are cash-grabby mobile titles. When this whole genre started, the idea was to get to the point that we could become a damn holodeck. Or a Matrix reboot. Push the envelope of PC gaming into the realms of virtual reality. I don't think any of us could have predicted that MMORPGs would just become another realm for mobile devices to dominate the microtransaction game. Actually, probably many of us did think that. Oh, MMORPGs yet to launch. Please save this damn genre. And if I seem overly harsh on mobile MMOs as a whole, please just understand that it's because the mobile microtransaction market is already incredibly dangerous. It's way too easily accessed by kids with mommy's credit card, something that I had described in my microtransactions video on the topic, that leads to a ton of fraud. Once people realized the gold mine in monetizing a mobile multiplayer game, they all set out to do the same, create a game that works just well enough on a phone and incentivizes purchases in the game. And the rest is, well, history. Anyway, to you guys, thank you for watching this video and being awesome. Let's do our best as a community to voice exactly how much we hate this recent trend towards mobile MMOs, because we know what that means. Speaking of cash sounds, check out our merch if you want to support me more, or please visit my Patreon where you can read some more goals and ideas for the channel. Please stay tuned for an important channel announcement before the end of the year that will detail the future of this channel. And of course, stay tuned for the clue concerning the next Death of Game episode. And above all else, question everything.